Good afternoon, fellow not ruminators. Welcome back to another session on my Declassified Caribbean news channel. Thank you so much for joining. And today we're going to look at a controversial topic: China and US elites, the relationship nobody talks about. I know that it's very, very customary that we think that China is different from the United States and all of that, but we have to look at history. We've got to look at what is happening, how we understand history, and what is happening in our present reality. Because what happens in history is impacting. A lot of times we are not, we don't have access to information, and we are not exposed to information. So we're going to have to expose ourselves to information that might seem uncomfortable, but we have to also deal with the uncomfortable truths. Okay, so for decades, the world has been told that China and the United States are locked in an epic struggle for global dominance. But beneath the headlines, another question emerges. In this live, we are going to be examining the economic, financial, and political ties that helped shape the modern global economy. From Wall Street and multinational corporations to manufacturing, trade, and globalization, we'll explore whether the rivalry between Washington and Beijing tells the whole story. Are Chinese and American elites more connected than most people realize? Who benefited from China's rise? Did globalization enrich elites on both sides of the Pacific? Are ordinary citizens paying the price for decisions made by powerful interests in both countries? Now, the topics that we are including in this discussion: the rise of China and the era of globalization, Wall Street's relationship with China. And in yesterday's last night's live, we talked about Wall Street's relationship with Nazi Germany, which was something that at the time people would not have been able to conceive or would not have understood. US corporations and Chinese manufacturing, the transfer of industry and jobs overseas, trade, finance, and elite interests, geopolitical rivalry versus economic cooperation, the future of China relations, who wins and who loses in the global economy. Join us for a thought provoking discussion and share your views in the comment section below. No? So good afternoon, good evening again once more. We are now going to start the program. We're going to examine, I have already said to you, a subject that is rarely discussed, honestly, in mainstream media. We're constantly told that China and the United States are engaged in a historic struggle for global dominance. We are told that the two countries are locked in an economic, technological, military, and ideological battle that will define the 21st century. And yet there is a question that few people ask. If China and the United States are such bitter rivals, how did China become the manufacturing center of the world in the first place? Who financed China's rise? Who moved thousands of factories to China? Who benefited from the globalization of production? Who became wealthier as American industries disappeared and Chinese industries expanded? This evening, we're going to explore whether the story is more complicated than the simple narrative of China versus America, which many people are engaged in because they lack knowledge. Because while governments may compete, elites often cooperate. I repeat that. While governments may compete, as you're seeing, the government of the United States doing, but elites often cooperate. And that distinction is critical. That distinction is critical to any critical thinking discourse. The official story is familiar. America is presented as the defender of the liberal international order. China is presented as the rising challenger. We hear about trade wars, tariffs, military tensions, Taiwan, the South China Sea, technology restrictions, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, the competition appears fierce. And in many respects, it is. But if that's the entire story, then another question immediately arises. How did China become so powerful? China did not wake up one morning and become the world's factory. Its rise took decades, and that rise occurred during a period when Western corporations were eagerly investing in China. Beginning in the late 20th century, many of the world's largest corporations moved production to China, and that is what Trump was responding to when he came back to power. Factories that once operated in North America and Europe began relocating. Now, was that coincidence or was that deliberate? Manufacturing jobs disappeared from many Western communities. Meanwhile, China's industrial capacity exploded. And those of you who have watched Life and Debt, that was a documentary that was presented on Jamaica, you would understand that the industrial class in Jamaica, the productive class, they really wanted to be productive in Jamaica. But the power elites there decided that they were going to make Trinidad the economic hub of the Caribbean. And they pushed that agenda, and the productive sector in Jamaica took a big fall. Okay, so what is happening in the Caribbean to in CARICOM was also engineered, and that is what we have to understand. I'm just giving you that analogy so you can understand what the United States citizens are going through. Also, they're suggesting that now, oh, the United States citizens have to be competitive, but the productive class that wanted to work and to and to innovate jobs, their productive capacity was actually taken to China, and it was a deliberate move. Meanwhile, China's industrial capacity exploded. This wasn't an accident, all right? This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't an unavoidable force of nature, as they're telling us. There were decisions. These were decisions, business decisions, financial decisions, political decisions. Companies were attracted by lower labor costs. They were not concerned about are they Americans and the elites there are nationalistic. They are not. They are nationalistic as far as money is concerned. Very important that you understand this very important point. Lower production costs, massive infrastructure investments, and access to a huge labor force. The result was extraordinary profits. Consumers received cheaper goods, corporations increased earnings, investors benefited, executives benefited. But many workers paid a heavy price. Entire communities experienced deindustrialization. Factories closed, local economies weakened, and economic inequality increased. So the question becomes, who truly benefited from globalization? That is the question. This is the question that we need to explore, and many of us are too lazy to do that. Okay? Now, the important fact that you need to understand is that elites don't always think like nations. They transcend nations. So when we're thinking about China and Jamaica and the United States, we must ask ourselves the critical question: who is Jamaica, or what is Jamaica? Who is the United States, or what is the United States? Certainly, that will help us to understand that we're not talking about a people, all right? But we have to look at what is happening between the elites and the ordinary persons within that society, the ordinary citizenry. Very important. And I have been saying that from the beginning of this channel. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming that national governments and economic elites always share the same priorities. They don't. They often do not. A factory owner may not view the world the same way a factory worker does. A multinational corporation may not view the world the same way a nation state does. An investment bank may not view the world the same way an ordinary citizen does. Political leaders speak about national interests. Corporations often focus on profits. Investors focus on returns. Financial institutions focus on growth. These interests sometimes overlap, but they don't always. This is why we must distinguish between competition between governments and cooperation between powerful economic actors. Very, very important that we begin to assess our understanding. And I always say to my students, right, that you always have to begin, you always have to read and analyze beginning with the correct premise. Even if you're reading the Bible and you're reading it from the wrong premise, you are not going to find out the truth, right? We have to read everything with the correct attitude, which is I want to learn something. I'm here not coming with my preconceived ideas, but I'm here to learn, even if I learn some uncomfortable truths. Very important that you begin to understand this, okay? Now, how did China rise? And we're going to look at that China's rise and Western capital. China's rise occurred alongside enormous flows of foreign investment. Okay. And, I think that Zbigniew Brzezinski, he did write a book about the technocratic age. And I think that it's wise to read those books by Zbigniew Brzezinski because you're going to learn a lot from him about where the agenda is heading. Technology entered China, factories entered China, capital entered China, management expertise entered China, global supply chains entered China. This does not mean China simply became a passive recipient. Chinese policymakers pursued their own strategy, and they were given that sort of autonomy, which many other parts of the world were not allowed to do. So when we keep comparing ourselves to China, sometimes I hear Jamaicans and other members of the Caribbean countries comparing themselves to China. The play field was not level. Okay? They invested in infrastructure, education, manufacturing, industrial policy, long-term planning. But it is also true that Western corporations saw tremendous opportunities in China. In many ways, China's growth and corporate globalization advanced together. This reality complicates the simplistic idea that China and America have always been enemies. It's a very simplistic idea. Okay? Today, we are witnessing growing tensions between Washington and Beijing. Tariffs, restrictions, economic decoupling, military competition, but even now, economic relationships remain extensive. Trade continues, investment continues, supply chains remain interconnected, and that raises another important question. Are we witnessing a genuine separation, or are we witnessing a reorganization of economic relationship that remains deeply interconnected? The answer is still unfolding. Now, what does this mean for the Caribbean? All that I'm saying here. Now, let's bring this discussion closer home to the Caribbean, because the Caribbean is often told that it must choose sides. Choose America, choose China, choose one bloc or the other. But perhaps the real lesson is different. Perhaps the lesson is that powerful nations pursue their interests. Powerful corporations pursue their interests. And Caribbean nations must learn to pursue their own interests as well. The question should never be, which great power should we serve? The question should be, how do we advance the interests of our people? That is a discussion many developing countries are now having. Now, I did write down here some books that I think that you need to get in your libraries and read. and read, because reading is what maketh the man, not studying and getting a degree. I'm saying reading, independent reading, reading and learning, okay, are the two fundamental tools that make the man or the woman. Now, the first book I would encourage you to read is The China Price, and the author is Alexandra Harney. This book examines how Western corporations helped transform China into the world's manufacturing powerhouse. It looks at outsourcing, labor, supply chains, and the impact on both Chinese workers rather, and Western industries. Why it's useful? It's easy to read. It focuses on the corporate side of globalization, and it also helps explain how multinational companies became deeply intertwined with China's rise. Another book I would also encourage that you, the viewing listeners, read is China Incorporated. That's China Inc. by Ted Fishman. This book explores China's emergence as an economic giant and how that rise affected global markets, industries, and labor. Now, why is this book useful? Accessible for general audiences, so you can read it, and it shows how China became integrated into the world economy. Another one is The World is Flat by author, and this is Thomas Friedman. And although many critics, disagree with some of Friedman's conclusions, this book explains how globalization connected businesses, workers, and economies across borders. And I'm going to suggest to you, not because you might not like a person, doesn't mean therefore that that person cannot uncover important facts. So you might hear that, Thomas Friedman is not somebody you want to read, but yes, you should read as widely and extensively as you can, compare information, here a little, here and a little there, and you're going to be able to understand how the world is actually functioning. Now, why is this book useful? It helps viewers understand the mindset behind globalization, because it is a mindset. It is a culture by itself. So when you talk about the Chinese culture or the American culture, are you also exploring and talking about the culture of globalization? And that is what I'm here to unmask and to help you to understand. And it also explains why corporations embraced global supply change. Another book that is dense and it what will be very useful to read is a book by the famous economist, the United States economist, Michael Hudson, and that is Super Imperialism, a very important book to have in your library. Hudson argues that the global financial system benefits powerful economic interests and explains how finance and geopolitics often work together. And why is this book useful? It challenges conventional narratives. It talks about the IMF, by the way, and the World Bank, and how the debt that we're paying to these institutions actually help the United States to conduct warfares around the world. Okay? Popular among audiences is interested in economic power and empire. So you want to go and get a copy of that book. I think it also can be downloaded online. I did not buy a copy from the bookstore. I did download it. So I think you can get a PDF version of Super Imperialism by Michael Hudson. Get it and read it on your phone or on your tablet, whatever you have. Now, another book that I would encourage you to buy is Trade Wars or Class Wars, and that's by Matthew Klein and Michael Pettis. Now, this is probably the single best recommendation that I can offer you. Trade wars or class wars. And in fact, W.E. Du Bois, right, who was a very outstanding and world famous African American, I think we all know him. He wrote the book, The Black Reconstruction, and he wrote the entire history of African Americans from the perspective of a class war, even though he knew that race was a problem, but he understood that the class war was what was more dominant than even the race war, right? They used the race war as a cover, but underneath that cover is or was when he wrote it the class war, because he wanted to understand for people to understand that at the end of the day the North and the South in the United States were united even in the Civil War, right? That it was never about ending slavery, it was consolidating, it was the consolidation, as it were, of their economic interests. And sometimes their economic interests between the North and the South collided, and slavery was at the center, of course, because that was where they were making their lots of money. So in the same way here, we can see that they're suggesting that China and the United States and other countries might be enemies, but are they real enemies? Okay? Or are we just talking about history and what is happening from the 1970s? We're not focusing on what happened and the economic transformation that began in China from the 1970s, when, what's his name there, that guy's name, that Secretary of State of the United States, Henry Kissinger, actually re-established that relationship between the United States and China. The authors argue that many economic conflicts described as China versus America are actually conflicts involving elites, workers, investors, and economic policy choices within both countries. Now, why is this book useful? Trade wars or class wars? It directly challenges simplistic national rivalries, because that conversation is simplistic. It examines who benefits from trade and globalization, and it uses evidence and economic data. Very important that you get yourselves a copy of that book. Another book which many of you have, I'm sure, suggested that we read is The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. And this is also another controversial but influential book that discusses how economic power, international finance, and political influence shape national development. Now, why is this book useful? It's very popular with audiences interested in geopolitics and sovereignty. And it also raises questions about the relationship between economic and political power. All right. So I think that you should get yourselves a copy of these books and try to read them. I would also suggest another author, and I was introduced to this author, and I think apart from the Bible, particularly the biblical prophecies of Daniel, the Revelation, I think that Anthony C. Sutton also helped me to understand from a secular perspective, okay, because he was not religious. He helped me to understand. He understood secular history like none other. So Anthony C. Hutton is best known for arguing that powerful Western financial and corporate interests helped build up what we call the geopolitical rivals, including the Soviet Union. So his work remains influential in some alternative history, geopolitical, and anti-establishment circles, though many of his conclusions are disputed by mainstream historians. But it does mean because they are disputed, it means that he is lying. You have to read for yourselves and connect the dots. Don't just sit before a dead professor, and even me, a dead podcaster, and not analyze the facts for yourselves. We need to talk less and read more. Now, some of the books that I encourage you to read: Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development. And these are 3 volumes. You can find them. But just Google Anthony C. Sutton, right? Not Hutton, but Sutton. Anthony C. Sutton. And you are going to find those books. Okay, so very important that you go there and you find some of those books. But I think the book that I read years ago was Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. I think you want to read that book. And so Sutton argued that some American and international financial interests had business relationships with German firms before and during Hitler's rise. So here we're seeing, and people talk about the fact as if the United States was in no way connected to what was happening in Nazi Germany. But if we read history, with more critical eyes, then we are going to realize that that is absolutely not true. All right, so I'm trying to encourage you to dig deeper than the simplistic conversations that we are having and we're hearing and we're seeing on different podcasts and at our major universities. Okay, and I think I was introduced to Anthony Sutton, not physically, but through his works, through his books from 2007, and I was in fact impressed with the quality of his research and his work. And do you know, because he has exposed the system, that he actually lost his career? He was pilloried for his insights that he shared. And he used to work at Stanford University, I believe, and they fired him, right, because of what he had exposed. Very important that we begin to read, and many of the preconceived ideas, right, and the knowledge that we think we have gleaned over the years will be challenged. Okay, and you just have to connect the dots, and you will see that in many times these conclusions are in fact correct, right? So was China's rise simply the result of Chinese policy, or was it also enabled by decisions made by Western corporations, investors, and policymakers? Are China and the United States truly locked in a struggle between completely separate systems? Or have economic elites on both sides of the political spectrum benefited from a relationship that is far deeper rather than most people realize? And perhaps the biggest question of all, when history looks back on the age of globalization, who will it conclude benefited the most? The nations, the people, or the elites? Let me know your thoughts in the chat. Where are you watching from? Please let me know. And do you believe China and American elites have been partners, rivals, or both? I want to hear where you are watching from. Let me know where you're watching from, and let me know what you are thinking, because the discussion begins right now. Now, let me end the conversation this afternoon with the book of Revelation 18, which actually corroborates, confirms that our world is interconnected and that there is a beast system, the Babylonian system, that controls all the merchants and the billionaires and all of the affluent class, the industrial classes of the world. And it begins here, Revelation 18. And after these things, I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. The lightened means knowledge. People are gleaning that the world in which they live is not what people say it is, not what you're learning in school, right? So people are learning, and you have to read. Okay, and he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. These are some strong words. It means, therefore, that every system here of Babylon, religious, economic, political systems, are rotten to the core, and there is no way we are going to transform it, because it has become what? The habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful birds. And what you're hearing about the Epstein files is just the icing on the cake. is just the icing on the cake. It is not the cake. What if we were to be exposed to the cake? For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. Somebody was saying to me, oh, you can't call Vatican City her because she's okay. Well, the Bible is suggesting that communication with her. And the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies, because there is a power here that is giving wealth to these nations and to these kings and to these merchants. And the kings of the earth, verse 9 is suggesting here, who have committed fornication, which means that they have adulterated themselves, they have sold themselves to the devil and lived deliciously. Many of your governments have given you up, right? And said that, oh, and they've sold you out. And they have lived deliciously with her, shall bewail her, and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning. Okay? Now listen to who are going to weep. And the merchants here being the businessmen, the corporations, the billionaires, and the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise anymore. The merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones and of pearls and fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet and all the fine wood and all manner of vessels of ivory and all manner of vessels of most precious wood. All right, and of brass and iron and marble, all of the minerals and all of the resources that we can think of, she owns. And cinnamon and odors and ointments and frankincense and wine and oil and fine flour and wheat and beasts and sheep and horses. And in the biblical time, horses were used for war. Now we're using weapons. So we can say weapons. We can add here that, in our modern day, okay, 21st century, and chariots and slaves and the souls of men. So even the souls of men, and by the souls of men here, you're having your minds controlled by this Babylonic or Babylonian system. You've got to be careful. If you, in today's age, are suggesting that China and the United States are rivals in the true sense of the word, that is for the Goyim. That is for the uneducated, right? But for those of us who understand how sophistication the deception is, we are going to unmask, we are going to comprehend that the elites, the American elites, the US elites, and the Chinese elites are working together against us, the ordinary citizenry, whether they are in China or in the United States or in Iran. And at the end of the day, we are their ultimate enemies. And the truth is the truth, whether you accept it or not. Thank you so much for joining.